My name is Iris Mercer, and the autumn I turned 21 years old, I was caretaking a closed summer cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan with a 4-year-old black and white border collie named Scout and exactly $847 to my name. It was the second week of October. The lake had already turned that deep, cold gray it turns in northern Michigan when the season has finally let go of summer. And the wind off the water at night was sharp enough to come through the cabin's old single-pane windows in long, thin drafts that crawled across the pine floor and along the baseboards. Scout slept beside me on a folded wool blanket at the foot of the iron camp bed in the back room, and his slow, steady breathing was the warmest sound in the house. I was 21 years old that October. My mother had died of breast cancer when I was 7 years old in a small hospital outside of Cadillac, Michigan. And my father, who had been a good man without being a strong one, had not been able to cope with what came after. And 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, he had quietly signed me over to the state. I went into foster care that November. For 10 years after that, I had lived in 6 different houses across the northern half of Michigan, most of them kind enough, none of them mine. On the morning I turned 18, the state had handed me a check for $1,042 and a folder of paperwork and a list of community college options, and they had quietly closed my file. I did not go to community college. I went to work. I had spent the 3 years since my 18th birthday taking the only kind of job that came with both a roof and a paycheck. Winter caretaking work on the summer cabins of wealthy downstate families who closed their lake houses up the day after Labor Day and did not return until Memorial Day. I lived in the cabins for 8 months at a stretch. I drained pipes. I shoveled paths. I watched for ice damage. I kept the wood stoves lit. I made $500 a month, plus utilities and groceries, and I did not need much more than that. I had Scout. I had a 2003 Chevy Tahoe with 220,000 miles on the odometer, given to me by the third foster mother I had loved. A quiet, kind woman named Mrs. Holloway who had died of a stroke the spring before I aged out. I had a folding cot, a duffel bag, an enamel percolator, a small cast iron skillet, a pile of paperback novels from the library, and a folded county map of northern Michigan with the names of every small town I had ever lived in, circled in red ink. I had Scout because 3 years earlier, in the second month of my first caretaking job, the woman who ran the small northern Michigan working dog rescue outside of Traverse City had called the cabin's listed number and told me she had a 6-month-old border collie pup who had been surrendered by a retired sheep farmer because the man could no longer manage him. She said his name was Scout. She said he was smart and watchful and had perfect black and white classic markings and the brightest amber brown eyes she had ever seen in a working dog. She asked me, with the careful kindness of someone who already knew the answer, if I might be willing to come and meet him. I drove the 40 miles to Traverse City that afternoon. I came home with him in the passenger seat of the Tahoe. He had slept beside me for 1,093 nights since, and he was, by a margin that needs no math, the single most important living being in the world to me. Then, in the first week of October that year, the cabin family I was caretaking had sent me a polite typed letter from their home in Grosse Pointe, informing me that they had finally accepted an offer on the cabin from a couple in Chicago. that the closing was scheduled for the 12th of November, and that they would need me out by the 1st of that month. They thanked me for 3 good winters of careful work. They enclosed a thoughtful final paycheck. They wished me well. I had 30 days. I had $847 in a small credit union savings account in Cadillac. I had Scout. I did not know where I was going. On the rainy October evenings when the wind off the lake was too loud to read in, I would sit cross-legged on the rag rug in the cabin's main room, with Scout asleep against my hip and the cast-iron wood stove ticking softly behind me. And I would scroll on my cracked phone through county tax auction websites all over northern Michigan. I was looking for nowhere in particular. I was looking mostly because looking at small, faraway properties I would never be able to afford felt the same as looking at small doors I might one day be allowed to walk through. That is how I found the listing for the Starlight Drive-In. It was on the official website of a small village called Pine Hollow, population 612, in the cedar and birch country southeast of Petoskey. The listing was a single faded photograph and 4 short typed lines. Abandoned entertainment property, Starlight Drive-In Theater, County Road, 491, approximately 11 acres, including screen, projection, booth, concessions building, equipment shed, village-owned, must assume ownership, $10 administrative fee, all back taxes previously settled. The faded photograph showed an enormous white-painted freestanding movie screen rising out of a sea of brown weedy field, with a small cinder block projection booth visible in the middle distance and a single low-slung concessions building behind it. The painted sign over the front of the concessions building was just barely legible in the bad photograph light. It said, Starlight, EST, 1953. I sat on the rag rug for nearly an hour looking at that photograph, with Scout's head on my thigh and my finger hovering above the Bid Now button at the bottom of my cracked phone screen. Scout, who knew, without being told when I was thinking hard about something, did not move. The wind came off the lake outside. The stove ticked behind me. I clicked the button. I bid $10. I paid the administrative fee with my debit card. I shut off the phone. I did not tell anyone because there was no one for me to tell. 3 weeks later, on the last Tuesday of October, a thick manila envelope arrived at the cabin's front porch with my name on it. Inside the envelope were a deed of transfer, a title form, a small brass key on a thin leather cord, a hand-drawn pencil map of the property, and a folded handwritten letter from the Pine Hollow village clerk. The letter said the property was mine. The letter said the power had been kept on at minimum service to deter scrappers. The letter said the gravel entrance road was passable in any season. The letter said, "Welcome." I packed everything I owned into the back of the Tahoe in a single careful afternoon. It did not take long. 2 cardboard boxes, a duffel bag, Mrs. Holloway's framed photograph from the bedside table, my enamel percolator, my small cast-iron skillet, Scout's stainless steel food bowl and his matching water bowl, a 20-pound bag of dry kibble, a glass jar of the raw carrot sticks I gave him most evenings as a treat, which he would carry around in his mouth for several minutes before he finally ate them. Scout watched me pack with the careful, interested attention of a working dog who has noticed that his world is rearranging itself and who is reserving judgment until he sees what comes next. We drove north on the morning of the 31st of October. 2 days before our deadline. The lake effect clouds were low and gray across the eastern sky, and the maples along the 2-lane road through the cedar country had already shed their leaves. Scout rode in the passenger's seat with his nose against the cracked window. We stopped halfway up at a small roadside diner outside of Manistee called Lou's. I had not eaten a real cooked breakfast in 3 weeks. I ordered 2 eggs over easy, 3 strips of bacon, hash browns crisp, dry wheat toast, and black coffee. The waitress, a kind woman of about 60 named Ellen, slid me a small saucer with the bacon set carefully aside on a folded paper napkin and said quietly, "For your dog," and she would not take a tip. I broke the bacon into pieces in the Tahoe's parking lot, and I fed it to Scout one slow strip at a time, while he stood politely on the gravel beside the driver's door, taking each piece from my hand with the gentleness border collies use when they know the food matters. We rolled into Pine Hollow just after 1 in the afternoon. It was a small and quiet place, a single white Methodist church, a small white painted village office, a green painted post office, a tiny tavern called the Buckthorn, a small grocery called Wells's Family Market, and out past the village on County Road 491, exactly 2¼ miles east into the cedar country. Behind a low, overgrown gravel berm at the side of the road stood the Starlight Drive-In Theater. The screen was the first thing I saw, rising 45 feet out of a long, brown field that had been mowed sometime that summer and then forgotten. The white paint on the front of the screen had grayed and weathered in long, vertical streaks. The plywood backing showed through in places, but the screen was standing, and the steel truss tower behind it that held it up was unbent, and even at a half-mile away on the gravel road, I could feel the way that giant rectangle of standing whitewashed plywood took up a piece of the autumn sky in a way nothing else on the road did. Scout stood up on the passenger seat with his front paws on the dashboard and his amber eyes wide. The entrance gate was a long iron pole on a counterweight, padlocked at the side. The chain through the padlock had rusted, but the iron was sound. The brass key in my envelope did not fit the gate padlock, but the village clerk had thoughtfully tucked a second small brass key into the manila envelope taped to the back of the deed that was labeled in tidy pencil gate. The padlock opened. The pole lifted. I drove the Tahoe slowly down the cracked asphalt entrance drive and into the long brown field of the drive-in itself. Rows of low metal speaker posts marched in arcs across the field where 200 cars had once parked on summer Friday nights. Many of the speaker posts still had their original metal speakers hanging from them, the cords cut clean. Some posts were bare. The whole 11-acre field rose in a long, gentle slope toward the screen at the far west end. I parked the Tahoe at the back of the field. I let Scout out. He bounded onto the brown grass with the immediate concentrated joy of a working dog who has been delivered to an entirely new and very large piece of land that needs herding. He ran a full loop of the field's perimeter at a hard run before he came back to my left leg and sat down, panting, looking up at me with his amber eyes saying, "Ready when you are." I unlocked the front door of the projection booth first. The booth was a single small cinder block building set on a concrete slab in the middle of the field, perhaps 30 feet behind the back row of speaker posts. The door was painted faded forest green. The little brass bell hanging on the inside of the door, which I had not expected, rang once when the door swung open. The booth had not been opened in 40 years. The interior was a museum that no one had ever turned into a museum. Two massive simplex 35 millimeter projectors stood on heavy iron pedestals in the center of the room, brass film magazines bolted on top, lenses still capped, every reel arm in its position. A small wooden workbench along the back wall held splicing equipment, a hand crank for rewinding film, and a row of glass jars labeled film cement and carbon rods in faded ink. Along the right-hand wall, floor to ceiling, were tall, narrow steel cabinets, fireproof film, storage cabinets, the kind every drive-in had been required by law to install. Each cabinet door labeled with a small brass plate in alphabetical order. The whole room smelled of brass and old film cement and the faint, sweet acetone smell that 35 millimeter celluloid gives off after it has been sealed away for a long time. I walked through the rest of the property next, while Scout circled and circled the field. The concessions building at the back of the lot was a low cinder block structure with three boarded up serving windows along the front and a screen door at the back. Inside, a chrome popcorn machine pushed against one wall, a long stainless steel hot dog roller, a small commercial soda fountain, a wooden counter with two old cash registers still bolted to it, a walk-in cooler at the back that was no longer cool. Behind the concessions building, set back into a stand of cedar trees almost out of sight from the road, was a low wooden equipment shed with two wide sliding doors fastened together with a thick rusted iron chain and a padlock the size of my fist. Scout went straight to the equipment shed. He did not stop at the projection booth. He did not stop at the concessions building. He did not stop at the screen. He ran straight from the back gate to the equipment shed, and he began to do the slow, careful herding loop he did when he had found something, circling the front of the doors, then circling around the side, then back to the doors, then around the side again. He did this for almost 10 full minutes while I unloaded the Tahoe. He did not bark. He did not paw. He just circled, slow and patient and absolutely certain. I slept the first night on a folded camp cot inside the cinder block projection booth. Because the projection booth was the only building on the property I had a working power outlet in. I plugged in a small space heater. I unrolled my sleeping bag. I set up my enamel percolator on the small workbench and heated water for coffee. For dinner, I opened a can of Campbell's chicken noodle soup on the small camp stove I had brought from the cabin, and I ate the soup out of a tin mug with a folded packet of saltines crumbled in. Scout had his dinner from his stainless steel bowl beside my camp cot, a full scoop of dry kibble with a small dollop of canned wet food mixed in. He ate fast and neatly, and then he came over and sat at my feet while I finished my soup. And I broke one saltine into halves and gave him both halves from my fingers. He took them with the careful softness border collies use for food they understand is being shared on purpose. When I had finished, I gave him a raw carrot stick from the glass jar in the box of his things. He carried the carrot in his teeth all the way around the projection booth twice, just to be certain of it, before he finally lay down at my feet and ate it in 3 crisp, slow bites. That first night, I dreamed of the screen. In the dream, the screen was lit. In the dream, I was 9 years old, and my mother was alive again, and we were watching a movie together from the front seat of my father's old station wagon. I did not see what the movie was. I only saw her face, lit blue from the screen, smiling. I woke before dawn to the sound of Scout whining softly beside my cot. He had not slept. He was sitting at the booth door, looking out the small window in the door, in the direction of the equipment shed. In the morning, I made coffee in the enamel percolator, and I cooked 2 eggs over easy in the small cast iron skillet on the camp stove. I ate the eggs on a tin plate, sitting cross-legged on the booth floor with Scout pressed warm against my left hip. I gave him the last bite of egg yolk off the plate when I was done. Then I took the bolt cutters I had brought from the cabin, and I walked out across the brown field with Scout at my left heel to the equipment shed at the back of the cedar stand. The padlock on the shed gave with a single hard squeeze of the bolt cutters. The chain rattled loose and fell to the dry grass with a heavy final clank. Scout pressed his shoulder against the right-hand sliding door, the same way Banjo would have done 2 stories north of here, and the door slid back along its rusted iron track with a long, deep groan that I felt in my teeth. The smell came out first, old motor oil, dry leather, the faint metallic sweetness of a place that had been sealed for 40 long years. The morning sun fell through the open doorway in a long, bright rectangle on the concrete floor inside, and at the far end of the rectangle I could see, even before I switched on the bare bulb hanging from the rafters, the long curved silhouette of an automobile fender under a heavy canvas tarp. I switched on the bulb. The shed was perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet deep. Along the right-hand wall were neat shelves stacked with cans of motor oil, a tool board with hand tools laid out as carefully as a surgeon's instruments, 3 spare projection bulb crates, and an old wooden footlocker with the words A. Pritchett, private stenciled across the lid in faded white paint. And in the middle of the shed, draped under a heavy canvas tarp, grayed to a uniform brown by 40 years of dust, was a car. I walked slowly to the side of the tarp. I put my left hand on the canvas. Scout pressed warm against my leg. I pulled the tarp back. It was pink, deep dusty rose pink with white interior visible through the open passenger window, and chrome trim along the long sloping flanks that caught the bare bulb light overhead in long bright streaks. The car was enormous. The hood was a long, pale pink sculpture that ended in a wide chrome grille, flanked by twin headlamps set into pointed chrome bezels. The tail fins at the back rose almost to the height of my hip and ended in twin rocket-shaped chrome tail lamps. The hood ornament was a small silver crown above the elongated script word, El Dorado, a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz convertible. I had only ever seen pictures. I sat down on the cool concrete floor of the equipment shed, and Scout came and lay down across my legs, and I did not move for a long time. I cried into the dusty short fur on the top of his head until my chest hurt. The bare bulb above us hummed quietly. When I could finally stand up, I walked back across the field to the projection booth with Scout at my heel, because the projection booth was the building with the records. And if the equipment shed had been the heart of this drive-in, then the projection booth was the brain. I climbed up onto a small step stool I had found beside the cash register, and I worked through the alphabetical fireproof film cabinets along the right-hand wall. The labels on the brass plates were the titles of every film the Starlight Drive-In had ever shown from 1953 through 1985. Most of the cabinets held only blank reels and empty cans. The Starlight had been a rental house. Most of its prints had been shipped back to the distributors at the end of each summer. But In the very last cabinet, at the far right of the wall, marked only with the letter Z on its brass plate, were three small oak boxes that had clearly never been part of the standard rental inventory. Inside the first box was a single complete original 35mm print of Citizen Kane in 5 reels, in pristine condition. The original 1941 RKO Radio Pictures shipping labels still on the cans. Inside the second box was a sealed manila envelope of black and white promotional photographs from a film called The Misfits, dated 1961, including 6 original silver gelatin prints of Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable on horseback in the Nevada desert. 5 of them signed by Marilyn Monroe in her familiar looping ink across the bottom margin. Inside the third box was the projectionist's leather-bound logbook of every film shown at the Starlight from June of 1953 through August of 1985, written in 3 different hands over the decades, including a small folded note tucked into the back cover dated the 2nd of September, 1985 in tidy ink. The note read, "This is the last log. The chain shut us down today. The Cadillac in the shed is for whoever cares enough to find her. She was my mother's. Drive her home. A. Pritchett." In the wooden footlocker stenciled, "A. Pritchett, private," on the floor of the equipment shed I found, that afternoon, a tin cigar box wrapped in newspaper. Inside the cigar box was the projectionist's last summer's concessions cash, perhaps $14,000 in unbanked 20s and 50s from the summer of 1985, never deposited because Mr. Albert Pritchett had died of a sudden heart attack in his projection booth on the evening of the 2nd of September that year, on the night the parent chain pulled the plug. The village had quietly taken ownership the following spring. The cigar box had been sitting under that newspaper for 40 years. I spent that first whole week alternating between the projection booth and the equipment shed and the long, brown field. I slept on the camp cot in the booth each night. I made coffee on the enamel percolator each morning. I cooked simple suppers, a small pot of pinto beans one night with a square of cornbread from a box mix, a grilled cheese and tomato soup another night, a baked potato with butter and salt, and a side of canned green beans on a Sunday. On the small camp stove on the booth workbench, Scout had his kibble in his stainless steel bowl by the booth door morning and evening, with a small dollop of canned chicken wet food mixed in at breakfast, and a single raw carrot stick from the glass jar after his evening meal. He took to making a careful, slow patrol loop of the full 11-acre field at first light each morning before he would come back inside for his food, as if he needed to confirm every day that the property was still where we had left it the night before. The classic car appraiser who drove up from a specialty dealership in Bloomfield Hills 2 weeks later was named Mr. Calloway, a careful older man in a clean gray suit who walked once around the Cadillac in the equipment shed without saying a word, and then knelt to look at the chassis number stamped on the firewall, and then opened the long pink hood, and then stood up and very quietly told me that what I had under that tarp was one of approximately 1,100 1959 Eldorado Biarritz convertibles built that year, that the original paint code on the data plate read Persian Sand Pink, a special order factory color, less than 90 produced in this color, and that the car had under 19,000 original miles on the odometer. He said its conservative auction value, restored only enough to make it run, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $450,000. Concours restored and sold at the right Pebble Beach event, that number was closer to 650,000. The film historian I called next, a kind woman named Dr. Hollister out of the University of Michigan Film Archive, drove up the following weekend. She spent 6 straight hours in the projection booth with white cotton gloves and a small lighted magnifier. When she came out onto the concessions porch where I was waiting with 2 enamel mugs of coffee, she sat down on the wooden step and she told me with a small, careful breath that the 35mm print of Citizen Kane in the Z cabinet was one of perhaps 4 surviving original 1941 RKO theatrical prints in private hands anywhere in the world, that the right auction at Heritage or Sotheby's would bring between $30,000 and $50,000 for that print alone, and that the 5 signed silver gelatin photographs of Marilyn Monroe from the Misfits, together as a set with the projectionist's documented chain of provenance, would bring somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 at the right specialty Hollywood memorabilia auction in Los Angeles. The Pritchett cash box held $14,240. It was, the Pine Hollow village clerk explained to me carefully over coffee at Wells's family market that afternoon, legally mine under the terms of the property transfer. The conservative combined value of everything Scout had found in the equipment shed and projection booth came to just over $570,000. With patient handling, Dr. Hollister believed that number was probably closer to 800,000. I did not sell the Cadillac. I want to tell you that I did, because that would be a simpler story. The truth is that I sold the Citizen Kane print and the Marilyn Monroe photographs through the Hollywood memorabilia auction the following May for a combined $168,000 after commissions. I kept the projectionist's logbook because the logbook belonged to the Starlight and not to me. I deposited the Pritchett cigar box cash and the auction proceeds together in the small community bank in Pine Hollow. I paid Mr. Calloway in Bloomfield Hills a deposit to begin the careful, sympathetic mechanical restoration of the Persian sand-pink Cadillac. I did not paint it. I did not change the original interior. I had him restore only the engine and the transmission, and the brakes and the electrical, the systems that made her run, so that she could be driven again the way Mr. Albert Pritchett's mother had once driven her on summer Sunday afternoons in 1959. I used most of the rest of the money to do something I will tell you about now. I reopened the Starlight Drive-In Theater the following Memorial Day weekend. I patched the screen myself with help from a man I had hired in Pine Hollow, named Mr. Whitfield, who did sign work. I had the projection booth electrical brought up to code by a small Petoskey electrical contractor. I had the projection bulbs replaced. I purchased a refurbished modern digital projector for the booth because there was no longer a market for 35mm theatrical prints, but I kept the 2 simplex 35mm projectors in place beside it, polished and oiled and ready for the rare special showings I planned for them. I reopened the concessions building with a new commercial popcorn machine, the original chrome one cleaned and restored beside it as a working display. I sent the original cash register out to be cleaned. I painted the front of the concessions building. I painted the words Starlight, EST, 1953, reopened 2026 in fresh gold paint above the serving windows. We opened on a warm Friday evening in late May. 148 cars drove down the cracked asphalt entrance drive the first night. Scout sat on the concessions porch beside me in his stainless steel water bowl, all evening greeting the families as they walked up for popcorn and Coke. The film we showed first was a fresh restoration print of It's a Wonderful Life, which I had picked not because it fit the season, but because Mrs. Holloway had loved it best, and on a long enough horizon, every important opening night is also a quiet funeral for someone. When the first reel was done and the screen went briefly dark for the intermission, and the cars in the long, curved rows on the slope below me began to flicker their headlights at the concessions building in the old drive-in tradition that means thank you, I sat down on the wooden step of the concessions porch with Scout across my feet, and I broke a piece of fresh hot popcorn into two halves, and I gave him both halves out of my open palm. He took them as gently as he had taken Ellen's bacon strips that morning at Lou's Diner outside of Manistee, and that was the moment I understood, with a small, clean certainty I had not yet had words for, that I was finally home. Albert Pritchett had been the projectionist at the Starlight Drive-In Theater for 32 consecutive summers, from 1953 until 1985. He had inherited the projection booth from his father, who had built the drive-in with money saved during the war. He had inherited the Persian sand-pink Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz convertible from his mother, who had bought the car new in Detroit in 1959, with money she had earned teaching second grade for 30 years. Albert had never married. He had no children. He had died alone in his booth on a Monday night in September of 1985, sitting at the splicing table with his hand on a reel of film. The village clerk's record said the volunteer fire department's first responders had found a single small framed photograph of his mother on the booth wall above the table where he had collapsed. The photograph was still there when I unlocked the booth 40 years later. I left it where it was. I think about Mr. Pritchett every time I climb up into the booth on a Friday evening to thread a film. I think about his mother every time I take the pink Cadillac out for a slow Sunday drive on the cedar-lined county roads with the top down, and Scout sitting alert in the white leather passenger seat with his amber eyes half closed in the warm wind. I think about my own mother every time I make eggs over easy on the small cast iron skillet in the kitchenette I built behind the concessions counter, where Scout has his stainless steel food bowl by the back door and his water bowl beside it on a folded blue dish towel, and where I keep a small glass jar of raw carrot sticks on the counter, because that is what a working dog deserves when he comes home from a long day of slow circling. If you are watching this and you are 21 years old and the family who took you in has just sent you a polite letter, and you have a folding cot in the back of an old SUV and a loyal dog asleep on a wool blanket, and $800 in a savings account, and nowhere in particular to go, I want you to remember two things tonight. The first is that the people who built the small, faraway places you are looking at on your phone screen built them on purpose, sometimes 70 years ago, sometimes for somebody they would never live to meet. And your only real job is to keep moving in some small, humble way until you walk into the room or the field or the equipment shed where they have been quietly waiting for somebody like you. The second thing is that small, loyal animals, herding dogs especially, but rabbits and cats and hounds too, know more than you think they do. They circle the right shed, They sit by the right door. They lead you, every single time, to the canvas tarp that has been quietly waiting for someone like you to pull it back. I am Iris Mercer, and this has been Truth of the Roads. Scout and I will see you on the next quiet road.